The outrage over Australia's Indonesian spying program threatens to damage Australia's economic relationship with the country, the largest economy in Southeast Asia and the third biggest democracy in the world. Last year, Australia's trade with Indonesia was worth $14.6 billion, but with a middle class that numbers 45 million and is set to reach 135 million within 15 years, the potential is enormous. Tim Harcourt is an economist specialising in international trade in the Asia-Pacific region. He was previously the chief economist at Austrade. He worked for the Reserve Bank and is now a fellow with the Australian School of Business at the University of New South Wales. He's just returned from a trip to Indonesia, where he was the guest speaker at a function organised by the Australia-Indonesia Business Council. And he joins me now from Canberra. Thanks very much for being there for us.
Thanks very much, Emma. Good to be back here with you.
Now, was this spying issue specifically raised with you while you were in Indonesia?
Yeah, it was by a number of the senior Indonesian journalists and, in fact, a former ambassador to Australia. And their view was, hey, in the 50s, when there was a communist insurgency, when Sukarno was there, as part of ANZUS, of course Australia would spy on Indonesia. But in today's world, 50 years later, we're friends, we're strategic partners, we're important economic partners in the region as a whole. It's not necessary and shouldn't be done.
So what's at stake as far as the economic relationship between Indonesia and Australia goes?
Well, the Australian presence commercially in Indonesia is very visible. You know, as I went to the airport in Jakarta, you see the blue sky sign, welcome to Jakarta. You see Orica blowing things up and Lateline building them up. You pass an ANZ ATM at the Jakarta airport. I mean, even ANZ, Lateline and BlueScope alone provide $2.4 billion investment in Indonesia. So there's a very strong Australian presence there, and there's 2,500 Australian businesses that actually export to Indonesia.
Given there are those 2,500 odd Australian businesses exporting to Indonesia, in what way might their lives be made uncomfortable as a result of this crisis of confidence between the two countries?
Well, certainly in certain sectors we've seen the beef issue blow up as it did under the previous government. In fact, at the conference I was at, the Northern Territory were there, the Chief Minister and the cattlemen and so on. They're very wary of that. But I think the interesting thing is, Emma, that when you look at the numbers of Australian companies that export to Indonesia, it's stayed pretty constant over the last 5 years, and that's an economy that's been growing at 4 to 6%, while in China it's probably tripled. And so you've probably got to say that even without the spying issue, without the diplomatic incidents, Australia is still probably underperforming in terms of our economic penetration into Indonesia.
Why is that?
I think it's partly to do with domestic Indonesian issues. Sure, under SBY it's got better in terms of democracy and transparency and corporate governance, but the World Bank says Indonesia is still a very difficult place to do business, and to some extent, Indonesia has always been a large domestic consumer market with the strong middle class, as you mentioned. It's never been a low-cost, make things cheap type of place. It's always been a large domestic, strongly nationalist market, and I think that reflects the data that we're looking at.
We hear time and again just how good a friend President Yudhoyono is to Australia. Is there a concern about the timing of this dispute, given we are so close to presidential elections in Indonesia where Yudhoyono won't be standing?
Well, I think he's gone out of his way to be a good friend of Australia's. I mean, I think from time to time certain Indonesian leaders have tried to be very helpful and constructive to Australia, and probably not just bilaterally, but when Malaysia was giving us a hard time over APEC and what have you, it was probably Indonesia and Thailand that stood up for Australia the most and said, look, Australia's a player in the region. And I think economically that's been very important, more so than just our bilateral partnership. And I think SBY has been an important part of that story, and he's under a lot of pressure domestically to attack Australia. And actually, he could get some runs on the board out in West Java if he attacks Australia.
So do you think in some respects this outrage publicly has been confected specifically to, in some respects, only just to elicit a certain response from the domestic audience?
No, this is a bit more deep-seated than this. I think you can probably say that Lady Gaga was banned from Indonesia for religious, political reasons. I'd say in this case, SBY has tried to be a bit of a global, regional statesman. He's tried to show people that Australia having ties with Indonesia is beneficial to the average Indonesian. And I think he probably feels like he's gone out of his way and he's been given a bit of a slap in the face despite, many years of constructive engagement as he grows the democracy.
Now, you were one of the government's chief economic advisors in trade back in 1999 during the diplomatic disputes over East Timor. Does that provide any indication of what we might expect in terms of economic impact?
Well, it's interesting, Emma, before East Timor and before the IMF crisis of '97 that really hit Indonesia hard and, of course, brought down Suharto, there were around 400 Australian companies there. It was quite a vibrant market for Australia. There's now only 150 when an economy has added, 45
You mean
million
resident
to the middle class.
in Indonesia?
Based in Indonesia, and there's 3,000 in China. So you've probably got to say that some of these incidents have taken their toll. With respect to East Timor, at the conference in Bali, we had a trilateral meeting between Timor, Indonesia and Australia. So I think to some extent Indonesia has sucked up a lot of its pride on East Timor and is trying to deal trilaterally with these types of issues. So that probably makes the recent events a little bit more insulting to SPY.
Tim Harcourt, we have to leave it there, and I congratulate you for staring down that moth that's been circling you throughout this interview. Thank you very much.
Trey Macassey. Thanks, Emma.
It's been revealed that Australian authorities have also been monitoring the phones of Australian politicians. Federal police have confirmed they've collected phone and internet